We were talking last week about some of these never-Trumpers coming around, like Mitt Romney, who did blasted Donald Trump in 2016, called him crass and crude and bad businessman, you name it. And now he's saying, well, it's Trump's party. It's a mega party. He's transformed us to a working class party, and you got to give it up. Well, there is a never-Trumper, self-described never-Trumper. He's not somebody who's been called a never-Trumper. He called himself a never-Trumper, proud of it. His name is Bret Stephens. And the New York Times hired him a few years ago, a Republican, because they wanted a Republican who was going to crap on Donald Trump. And in Bret Stephens, they got a nerdy, erudite kind of guy, the kind of person that the New York Times likes to use to do exactly that. Well, his first column, we talked about this in the past, his first column was a column about his skepticism, not about climate change, but about climate change alarmism. And so many people called the New York Times to cancel their subscriptions that the then New York Times managing editor, his name was Dean Baquet, at a town hall was shocked. He said the whole point of having an op-ed page is to have opposite points of views. And he talked about how so many people called to cancel their subscriptions because Bret Stephens was hired, A, and B, wrote a column where he was skeptical of climate change alarmism. And that's when Dean Baquet famously said, we on the left, and he caught himself because he said we, meaning identifying himself as somebody on the left, even though supposedly he's nonpartisan, we on the left need to do some soul searching. We have gotten to the point where we don't want to consider a thoughtful disagreement. We don't even want to consider a thoughtful disagreement. That's not exactly verbatim what it said, but it's pretty close. We don't want to hear thoughtful disagreement. Now, if that isn't telling you everything you need to know about the fake news, this is well before the papers like the LA Times and the Washington Post declined to endorse Kamala Harris. But here he is, the most prestigious, most influential newspaper in America, the New York Times, the managing editor, who happened to be black, by the way, first black managing editor, said, we on the left don't want to hear thoughtful disagreement. Well, Bret Stephens has now done a 180 on Donald Trump. He wrote a column, and he says, it's time for us to knock it off. It's time for Trump's perennial, his word, critics, to, quote, drop the heavy moralizing and incessant doomsaying, end of quote, about the incoming number 47 and his administration. Here's what Mr. Stephens said in part, quote, who and what is Trump? He's a man and the symbol of a movement. The man is crass but charismatic, ignorant but intuitive, dishonest but authentic. The movement is patriotic and angry, end of quote. He said a lot of stuff, of course. I'd let you know how much he still dislikes him, but he has to give it up because he realizes that his train has left the station. He said some of the anger that Trump has tapped into is, quote, correctly directed at a self-satisfied elite that thinks it knows better but often doesn't, close quote. Look in the mirror, bro. He said Trump understood during the 2024 campaign that, quote, ordinary people cared greatly about the high cost of living and the migrant crisis at the border. Well, duh. And then he said this. He said essentially that I had no idea where my mind was when I kept trashing this man. Quote, how come so many who denounced Trump as a sexual predator were 20 years earlier Bill Clinton's steadfast defenders? Let me interject something real quickly. One of whom was George Clintonopoulos. Clintonopoulos, the one who said over and over again that Donald Trump had been found liable for rape, and then later on said he was convicted, found guilty of rape. He was one of Bill Clinton's staunchest defenders when he was one of his top aides when Bill Clinton ran for president. Remember the allegations made by among others, Paula Jones and Juanita Broderick and Kathleen Willey. There he was, George Clintonopolis, trashing them. Now, fast forward, he's the chief news anchor for ABC News, an objective journalist. It's ridiculous. So Bret Stephens could very well have been talking about people like George Clintonopolis when he said, quote, "Why were the same people who demanded investigations into every corner of Trump's family business so incurious about the Biden family dealings, like the curiously high prices for Hunter's paintings," end of quote. Really? And where were all these people, he said, who were calling Donald Trump a sexual predator, who were defending Bill Clinton? Stephens said this, and I'm quoting, "We missed that his working class appeal," referring to Trump, "would also reach working class minorities, like the 48% of Latino male voters who cast their ballots for him last month. And we were alarmed by Trump's protectionism and big spending ways, but the economy mostly thrived under him, at least until the pandemic," end of quote. Again, this is Bret Stephens, a self-described Trump hater and a columnist with the New York Times, in a New York Times column writing all of this. Quote, "If democracy means anything, it's that ordinary people, not elites, get to decide how important an event like January 6th is to them. Turns out, not so much," end of quote. Again, this guy is all but saying, I had my head up my you-know-what. I'm part of the self-satisfied elite that people don't give a damn about. We thought January 6th was an insurrection, that it was an attack on the foundations of the republic, and Americans didn't give a rip. They thought it was a bunch of morons who staged a riot, and they were acutely aware that Donald Trump said, "I want you to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard," something that people like Bret Stephens and the January 6ers have completely and totally and persistently and intentionally ignored. Yeah, Donald Trump was twirling his mustache saying, "I want you to go in there. I want you to threaten the lives of Mike Pence, threaten the lives of Nancy Pelosi, and set the place on fire, and that will endear me to the American people." Are you kidding me? But that is a narrative that they believed. Now Stephens winds up by saying people like moi and other people who have been never Trumpers, who've trashed the man from day one, need to back up and bow down. Quote, "So here's a thought for Trump's perennial critics, including those of us on the right. Let's enter the new year by wishing the new administration well, by giving some of Trump's cabinet picks the benefit of the doubt, by dropping the lurid historical comparisons to past dictators, by not sounding paranoid about the ever-looming end of democracy, by hoping for the best and knowing that we need to fight the wrongs that are real and not merely what we fear, that whatever happens, this too shall pass." End of quote. Now, I know my friend who no longer speaks to me because he is angry that Donald Trump mocked a handicapped reporter. He's a big fan of the New York Times. Maybe he'll read the article. I'll keep you posted.